And then I remember. Yeah, it was all.
Right, good morning, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce one of my good friends and good colleagues again. This is Dr. Matthew Fisher. So Dr. Fisher, he's an Army brat. He was originally born back in Bavaria, Germany. He's the youngest of 3 boys, 2 older brothers. All 3 of them were adamantly against joining military service in their youth, but all of them would eventually follow in their father's footsteps and end up joining the Army in college. He grew up mostly in the South. He's moved from Georgia to Florida, Texas, ultimately ending up in his home city of San Antonio, where he's grown up since the age of 7. So he started college at St. Philip's College, which is a historically Black community college, before obtaining a BS in psychology at the University of Texas in Arlington. And he went on to attend McGovern Medical School in Houston, Texas, under the HPSP scholarship. His interests in psychiatry include addictions, adolescent medicine, PTSD, complementary and alternative medicine, and psychedelic assisted therapies. He's currently part of the KMO team at Walter Reed, and he's looking forward to graduating from the program this June. In his free time, he enjoys volunteering in the community, hiking, listening to music and going to concerts, eating good food with great friends, spoiling his dog and cat, and of course, most of all, annoying his amazing and very patient wife. Here's Dr. Matthew Fisher.
Thank you. Thank you, Oman. So yeah, I'm Captain Matthew Fisher. I want to give thanks really quick to Major Aaron Wolfgang, who was my supervisor for this. He gave me a lot of wisdom, insight, and patience on this, but I'll be discussing psychedelic assisted therapies, past, present, and future. In terms of disclosures, I don't have any disclosures. I'm not getting paid for this presentation. And my objectives are to understand the term psychedelic assisted therapy, the history of these treatments, and how we got to where we currently are. Explore some of the most evidence-based psychedelic assisted modalities and the treatment designs, and discuss expectations for these treatments going forward, both in and outside the military. So why am I doing my grand rounds on psychedelic assisted therapy? This has been an interest of mine since I was studying psychology as an undergrad a few lifetimes ago, but more recently it has been a major topic in popular media, with the most recent research on these substances being very positive and promising. As such, I felt we needed a primer on psychedelic assisted therapies for those with limited knowledge, and hopefully I can teach everyone in this audience here something new that they can use in their future practice. A disclaimer up front, Colonel Amin asked for no psychedelic slides during our grand rounds, so I apologize, there'll be a lot of psychedelics on my slides. Colonel Amin also asked us to focus on topics and discussions that will make us change our practice. So I have a short video here. I think to change our practice, we need to first change our mind on what psychedelic assisted therapy is and be open to it as an option in psychiatry. This trailer, I think, sums that up pretty well after this advertisement. Go ahead.
This tension continues to grow. If it ends, what's the peace look like?
We're all striving to have good health and happiness.
This medicine helps things about psychedelics. We've all heard really scary things about psychedelics. They scrambled your chromosomes. They caused you to hop off of buildings. It was all terrifying. So I took a look at the true effects of these substances. I was very surprised at what I found. Mescaline, psilocybin, MDMA, LSD.
For a lot of people, this was the bad and evil drugs. But the opposite is true. There are really people who could benefit.
Can't wait to see what's going to happen.
What if mental health problems like OCD, PTSD, alcoholism, and depression could all be helped
I'm a fairly conservative, sober scientist, but I've seen it work.
And this medicine here starts to help heal.
Some of my friends said, don't do it.
Psychedelic therapy has the potential to revolutionize mental health care.
They broaden the lens and you realize, oh my goodness, there's all of this. I didn't know.
It's like a light bulb has gone off.
My story is the same story as millions of veterans. Where my story becomes unique is I took MDMA 3 times. It saved my life.
It really did short-circuit this suicidal period that I was in.
It's not like magic bullet that everything's perfect.
But just think how much human suffering could be relieved. This is the tool for understanding the mind.
María Sabina fue una mujer que ahora sí le abrió puerta a todo el mundo.
This tension continues to grow. If the drug war ends, what's the peace look like?
We're all striving to have good health and happiness.
This medicine helped me stand on my own 2 feet.
True science probes the very frontiers of human knowledge. And that's where psychedelic research is right now.
Well, that was my presentation, so thank you for coming in. But no, in all seriousness, I really do care about psychedelic assisted therapy, and I think everyone here should care a lot too. In fact, the real reason I care so much about psychedelic assisted therapy is because
we've all heard
Prince Harry cares. So I believe everyone here should care because Prince Harry cares. No, but I really want to emphasize that this recent turn of popular culture embracing the possible therapeutic benefits of psychedelics is great. But it's also worrisome since it is outpacing the current scientific literature and evidence, and we need to be more cautious going forward with these therapies. The newest research is showing real promise for these treatments to be effective and safe for many people suffering from mental illness, but we need to ensure we understand the real benefits and real risks because certain cities and states are already passing laws decriminalizing, even legalizing these substances. And as the data keeps coming, several are likely to gain FDA approval very soon. So now that I've hopefully convinced you to care and pay attention to my talk, what even are psychedelics and what is psychedelic assisted therapy? To understand that, we first need to take a quick trip through the history of psychedelics. And I apologize, Dr. Amin, this is the most psychedelic slide I have. But we're going to start with the traditional and indigenous use of psychedelics. So I think it's important to acknowledge and remember that many of the substances we use today, including one of the psychedelics we will be discussing more in depth, come from ancient practices that even today are still utilized by many cultures. Modern day usage of psychedelic plants by non-Western cultures include the Amazonian use of ayahuasca, a plant compound containing DMT, the North American Indian use of the peyote cactus, which contains mescaline, and the worldwide use of magic mushrooms, which contain psilocybin, which we'll be discussing more. And that's just to name a few. This man in particular, I want to take a moment to discuss more about. His name is Quanah Parker. Quanah Parker was a war leader of the Quahati tribe of the Comanche Nation until his death in 1911 when he was posthumously given the title of last chief of the Comanche. He is currently buried at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, because that's where his ancestors' original homeland was. So his grave was actually moved there after his death. He was a son of a Quahati chief and an Anglo-American white mother who had been abducted as a 9-year-old child and was subsequently assimilated with the Comanches. The reason why I'm discussing this gentleman is because he founded a church called the Native American Church in the late 1800s in Oklahoma Territory. The church was also known as peyotism because the importance of the psychedelic cactus to the church was critical. During the war on drugs in the 1970s, the church's regular use of peyote became a pressing legal issue. This resulted in the passing of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978, which allowed the Native American church to legally use peyote cactus to increase their communication with their God. Today is the most widespread indigenous religion among American Indians in the United States, with over 250,000 adherents. It's 250,000 people subscribe to this church, which has peyote cactus as one of its central tenets. So even though American Indians had formed their own church in the 1800s, which incorporated use of peyote, psychedelic use in Western society was still practically unknown. That is until the second wave of psychedelics, called such because it was Western culture's first time really exploring these substances. Modern use of psychedelics began when a Swiss chemist by the name of Dr. Albert Hofmann synthesized a chemical now known as LSD in his lab. That was in 1938. 5 years later, on April 19th, 1943, he became the first person to actually intentionally ingest the LSD. That day is now colloquially known as Bicycle Day, because as he became aware of the effects of the drug he ingested, he panicked a little bit, got on his bike, and rode home from his lab as the very first trip on LSD. Sandoz Labs, which is the lab that he worked for in 1945, began distributing LSD and later psilocybin globally for clinical use and research. And because of that, the field of psychedelic research boomed. At the time that was happening, these drugs were called psychotomimetics or hallucinogens because of their effects. But there was a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Humphrey Osmond that did not like those terms. He thought they were biased and misleading. So he wrote his current friend Aldous Huxley, which some of you might be aware is the author that wrote A Brave New World and A Doors of Perception, for alternate names to these substances. In one letter in particular, he wrote a poem to Aldous Huxley, which went, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." And that was in 1956, and that was the first time psychedelic was used as a term, and it stuck. Up until the late 1960s, though, psychedelic research was very promising, with more than 40,000 patients being administered LSD alongside therapy, and more than 1,000 scientific papers being published. But then came the counterculture movement in the 1960s. The counterculture movement, which was an anti-establishment, anti-war, and a liberal civil rights movement promoting phenomenon, was reaching its zenith in the US, led by cults of personality, including William Burroughs, Ken Casey, and Timothy Leary, which is this gentleman right here. Timothy Leary, in particular, was a successful psychologist at Harvard, known for the Concord Prison Experiment and other experiments, and starring the Harvard Psilocybin Society. He was, however, fired in 1963 due to giving out LSD to people outside the research labs. But his and other people's influences continued to grow even after he was fired. Because of this unauthorized use by the general public, they began to suffer negative press and increasingly restrictive laws. Sandoz Labs, in particular, quickly followed suit and stopped production and distribution of their psychedelics in 1966. But the cat was already out of the bag. They were still being produced and used on the streets by people all over the US and the world. President Nixon, who was president at the time, was concerned about the effects of the drugs on the youth, despite the evidence of the time showing only a minority of the population used these drugs, and the clinical research was very promising for treating mental disorders. Lack of public support for war efforts in Vietnam and the growing popular media spin of these drugs ruining the American youth resulted in the Nixon administration scheduling these drugs into a federal category of high danger and no medical potential, known as Schedule I. So after the boom of scientific and cultural exploration of the psychedelics in the 50s and 60s, all research was slowed to a near halt. President Nixon later in 1971 declared a formal war on drugs, which put the final nail in the coffin. All research was stopped. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the war on drugs raged, and the governmental intervention severely hampered global psychedelic research, despite evidence of their safety and therapeutic potential. But then came the 1990s, and with it, the third wave of psychedelics started to form. Scientists were able to cut through the bureaucratic red tape, and psychedelic research is now booming again. There's more psychedelic research happening today globally, both for neuroscientific and therapeutic purposes, than any time in history. And this is just a little picture I like that kind of shows you how that's been happening. So 2010, this is just for psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD. There's been a trend now where they've been skyrocketing up. And this study was in 2021, January. So there's actually more studies in this in 2021, even more studies in 2022. It just keeps growing. This is just for those three substances, not for other drugs, which includes things like ketamine, ibogaine, DMT, just to name a few. There's quite a few. So now that we know the history of how we got to where we are today in terms of psychedelics, let's get to the fun part, discussing these psychedelic assisted therapies and how they work. So the three psychedelics we are going to be discussing today are ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA because they're the most researched and most promising of the psychedelics. All three are colloquially called psychedelics, but only psilocybin is considered a true psychedelic in the classic sense. And this quote is from Grinspoon and Bacalar, some researchers, and I think it sums up what a psychedelic drug is pretty well. And it's that a psychedelic drug is one which, without causing physical addiction, craving, major physiological disturbances, delirium, disorientation, or amnesia, more or less reliably produces thought, mood, and perceptual changes otherwise rarely experienced except in dreams, contemplative and religious exaltation, flashes of vivid involuntary memory, and acute psychoses. And this is another picture I like that really helps separate the psychedelics into different classes. So not all psychedelics are the same. They differ in structure and psychological subjective effects. So if you look at this diagram, ketamine is at the bottom with the dissociatives, but it's considered a non-classical psychedelic in the same category as PCP and also MDMA. MDMA is considered a phenylethylamine, which is very similar to things like dopamine and the amphetamines, but it's not considered a classical or true psychedelic like psilocybin is. Psilocybin is actually very close structurally to things like serotonin, but it's also lumped together with LSD and mescaline as well. So I like the way this lays it out in terms of the different types of psychedelics. You can think of the classical at the top or non-classical at the bottom, and the different structural breakdown of the psychedelics. So even though different in structure and overall effects, they are therapeutically similar in some aspects. It is thought that psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA all affect our major neural networks in similar ways. So these are the four main neural networks implicated in major depressive states on the left-hand side. I promise I won't belabor this too much, so those sitting in the back of the room, please don't fall asleep on me. But fMRI studies have shown that depressed people usually have an overactive default mode network and an underactive ventromedial affect, salience, and central executive network. And it's thought that these aberrations or changes in the neural networks within the brain contribute to the depressive symptoms of rigid, stuck thinking, decreased motivation, and negative ruminations. Psychedelics, however, have been shown to reverse these effects in fMRI studies. So they actually down-regulate the default mode network and quiet it down, and they upregulate, in particular, the salience network and somewhat the ventromedial and central executive networks. And it's thought through these actions, it allows them to break through those stuck thoughts and have a more emotional, reactive breakthrough with the therapy. Some other similarities between the different psychedelic assisted therapies is that even though they have many different protocols, universally, the drug is assisting the psychotherapy in obtaining a quicker and more robust therapeutic response. What that means is that these drugs don't work as well without the therapy, just like the therapy, as the data is showing, is not as effective without the drugs. So set and setting are incredibly important for these substances. The set is a patient's mindset going into and during the session, and this can be influenced by the patient's mood, recent events, preconceived notions of the medication, and counter-transferences towards the therapist. The setting is a container or room and people around the patient. This includes the general vibe of the room, the sounds, smells, sights, even the temperature, etc., that all influence the mindset. Set and setting importance cannot be overstated, which is why many psychedelic assisted therapies spend considerable time in their preparatory sessions before dosing the patient. This image in particular is from the Johns Hopkins studies and is an example of a typical psychedelic assisted therapy session with a calming room, comfortable couch, eye shades, the two therapists next to the patient, and then usually there's some music playing as well. So that brings us to our first psychedelic assisted therapy, ketamine. The reason why I'm talking about ketamine first is it's the most widely used, accepted, and currently the only FDA-approved psychedelic in its S enantiomer form. As you can see from this New Yorker article from 2021, it is also already mainstream with many ketamine clinics and companies throughout the country. So what is ketamine? I'm not going to butcher that chemical name, but there it is. On the streets, it is known as K, Ket, Special K, Kit Kat, Kitty Valium, and many other names. But it is a non-barbiturate dissociative anesthetic that's on the WHO list of essential medications, And more recently, it's being used as a novel rapid antidepressant, and it's FDA approved as an enantiomer form, and it's also a non-opioid analgesic. So what about the safety and risks of ketamine? Clinically, it can be administered in almost any route, but it's usually administered in either IV, IM, intranasal, or sublingually given in clinics. IV dosing is typically between 0.10 to 0.75 milligrams per kilogram for therapy, with effects lasting about 1 hour after administration. Recreationally, people on the streets, if they're doing IV, dosing is very different for different routes of administration, but IV, they do about 1 milligram per kilogram. And anesthetic dosing is usually greater than 2 milligrams per kilogram, with the LD50 being estimated at greater than 12 milligrams per kilogram. So it really shows you the dose range that they're usually working with in the clinic for ketamine-assisted therapy is much lower than what's being abused on the streets and given for anesthesia. Side effects are transient and mild with the possibility of visual and perceptual alterations, and there's dose-dependent dissociative effects. The latter may cause worsening of anxiety or mood, but it's usually manageable in a clinical setting. And while the psychoactive effects like dissociation are considered a side effect of the medication, there's some researchers that actually posit that that could be a therapeutic value for the patient with the therapy. Hypertension and tachycardia may also occur, and pre-existing cardiac conditions may be contraindications for use. And there is abuse potential with ketamine. Obviously, it's abused on the streets, but rarely in the clinical studies is that an outcome when it's in a controlled environment. It's considered relatively safe even in much higher anesthetic dosing, but when given IV at any dose, it is recommended to have capabilities for rapid intubation in case the patient loses their airway. So what about the history of ketamine? Where did it come from? It was first synthesized in 1962 as an alternative to PCP by researcher Calvin Stevens, who worked for Park Davis. In 1964, Dr. Edward Domino conducted the first human trials of ketamine, unfortunately with men incarcerated at Jackson State Prison, Michigan. Dr. Domino noticed that higher doses ketamine was sedating, but at lower doses, it produced odd psychoactive effects on otherwise lucid patients. And the researchers at the time called this effect dreaming or an emergence phenomenon. Park Davis, though, wanted to avoid characterizing the drug as a psychedelic, because if you look at the dates here, 1964, that was the same time the counterculture movement was really kicking off, and there was a lot of bad media spin about psychedelics. So Dr. Domino's wife suggested the term dissociative anesthetic instead, to describe the way it seemed to separate the mind from the body, even as a mind retained consciousness. The FDA approved ketamine in 1970 as an anesthetic, and it became widely used in the Vietnam War and is still widely used today in combat, EDs, and ORs because it's considered a relatively safe emergency anesthetic because it retains reflexes and for the most part allows patients to retain their airway. However, ketamine also became a popular dance floor drug, especially amongst ravers. In the 1990s, the US government made ketamine a Schedule III substance. What that means is it's considered addictive, abusable, but it's also got medical potential. Clinicians at Yale, however, were using the drug in studies to mimic the symptoms of schizophrenia, and during those studies, they noticed that ketamine instead improved their patients' moods. So they began studying it as a treatment for depression. In 2006, the NIMH concluded that a single IV dose of ketamine had rapid antidepressant effects. This research was led by Dr. John Crystal, who's the current chair of psychiatry at Yale. Since then, over 300 clinical trials have been held, with the broad consensus being that ketamine relieves symptoms of depression up to days or weeks, during which psychotherapy is often more effective. And the result of that research has been that there's been a boom of NMDA antagonist research for depression. In March 2019, the FDA approved intranasal S-ketamine, again, an S-enantiomer of ketamine, for prescription use for treatment-resistant depression. And more recently, DXM or dextromethorphan bupropion, Auvelity, in August of 2022. So how does ketamine work? Biologically, it targets the NMDA receptors blocking them, which modulates the glutamate activity and overall increases BDNF, or brain-derived neurotropic factor. Ultimately, though, this results in dendritic spine formation and synaptogenesis. Ketamine is a very dirty drug, though, and there's still much research that needs to be done. It's been known to affect activity with the sigma, cholinergic, monoaminergic, and opioid systems, as well as others. What about psychologically? It's thought that it is dose dependent in regards to the type of therapy that can be implemented. So ketamine in low doses causes what's called a trance state, which is potent for respite, analysis, and meditative presence, and promotes communication, access to difficult states of mind with less fear of those encounters and a relief from obsessive and depressive concerns. The key there is that conscious awareness and an ability to communicate is maintained throughout the experience. And during that calm state, they're more open to the therapy being undergone. But ketamine in high doses, though, is called a transformative state. And with that, it brings a reduction of sensory awareness that is considered spiritual and liberatory in nature. This has been shown to bring changes to the self-concept, emotional attitudes to aspects of self and others, and changes in life values and purposes. This experience, or the transformative state, can be considered very similar to other psychedelics like psilocybin. It's theorized that this transformative state can catalyze, deepen, or overall increase engagement in a psychotherapeutic process and facilitate reflections in psychological material presented during the acute subjective experience. So the therapist's role in these experiences for the transformative state is more emotional support on the come up, and then when they're going through it, but then on the come down or in the integrative sessions after the therapy, they do more psychodynamic work with the patient to kind of help piece together what they experienced. I have another short video. This video is a short excerpt from a ketamine assisted therapy clinic known as Nushama. It's a session with one of their patients. You will see a therapist with the patient guiding them through the initial come up, nursing staff on hand, and then at the end, a medical physician discussing how the session went with the patient. I want you to please pay attention to the set and setting in the video as previously discussed.
What are you gonna put me on?
The deadbeat.
Oh my God, you're putting me on obituaries? Don't you come any closer, I will kill you.
I'm already dead.
Fun fact, you're the only one that can see me.
No!
Yep.
No!
No, it's not. It's not. Skip it.
This adult gel that creates safety, that creates connection. And remember, you have nowhere else to be but here with yourself. And it's a beautiful thing to get to know yourself tonight.
Yeah.
So have a beautiful journey, my friend.
Thank you.
It's kicking in. Something's happening. Let myself meet the unknown. That's what I'm hearing. I'm surrounded by love. I'm surrounded by love.
Did I just hear him? No, he's talking. Some people talk, some people are very quiet. Everybody has different reactions to it.
16?
Rest
Just
is
the time?
16.
Okay, sedation, yep, 2.
You're stable.
Okay.
How are you feeling right now? ability to still feel a little dizzy.
Yeah.
A little dizzy.
The dizziness happens when there's a disruption in our depth perception between the two eyes, so it can make things dizzy. And sometimes I have people, you can actually put the mask on, and the mask will help when you get rid of the visual stimulation. It'll help with the dizziness a little bit.
Yeah.
So during the journey, you were expressing, you were quite vocal. You're screaming. You said a lot of love. You just kept on saying, I want love. I want love. I want love. Over and over. And you're crying, you know, and it's to be able to express that, I think, is incredibly therapeutic. And the people who've had some, more, we don't call them difficult journeys, emotional journeys. These are the ones I find are reassuring to me. It means this stuff is working. It's about being able to express yourself and being in a safe place where you can express yourself and to cry. Men don't cry very often. We're not allowed, we feel like we're not allowed to. We have to show strength. And to be able to do this during this journey is I think, is incredible medicine.
So that's just an example of how ketamine-assisted therapy sessions can go. There's different protocols in different clinics and how it's being done. So, yeah. So what's the future of ketamine-assisted therapy? Ketamine was the first psychedelic given FDA approval with its S enantiomer form, which is known as Spravato, in 2019. And currently there are many clinics and hospitals already taking advantage of this, including now Walter Reed. Walter Reed now has a Spravato clinic on hand on the 7th floor. It is important to stress, particularly given the availability of ketamine clinics, that while ketamine administration may be sufficient to relieve some symptoms, the combination of the drug with psychotherapy might produce more profound and lasting changes for the patient. Ketamine is likely to continue growing as a tool in the psychiatry arsenal, with many different modalities and protocols taking form. That brings us to our next psychedelic assisted therapy, psilocybin. But first, we need to discuss the 3 different types of mushrooms. The first one are the ones that you can and you should eat. The other ones are the ones that you can't and you should not eat. And the last one are the ones that you can, but should you eat them only if when medically indicated after being screened for contraindications as an adjunctive to psychotherapy in a clinically supervised setting. Should you take these mushrooms? So psilocybin, again, I'm not going to try to butcher that chemical name, but on the streets it's known primarily as magic mushrooms. And the reason that it's known as magic mushrooms is it's naturally occurring prodrug compound produced by over 200 species of fungi, primarily the psilocybe genus of fungi. It is now a controlled Schedule I substance, meaning that the government views it as having no medical value and being extremely dangerous. But there's growing body of research showing antidepressant, anti-addiction, and quality of life improving effects of this substance. So what about safety and risks? Clinical doses usually range from about 10 to 25 milligrams of pure psilocybin, which is about 1 to 3 times the recreational dose taken on the streets of magic mushrooms. And the effects usually last about 4 to 6 hours. Psilocybin is considered incredibly physiologically safe, with a very high LD50 of 280 milligrams per kilo. It's considered non-toxic, non-addictive, and without any long-standing ill effects if used in a clinically supervised setting. In fact, there's research coming out that it's considered anti-addictive, with people reporting decreased abuses of addictive substances, including tobacco, alcohol, and opiates after sessions. Side effects are usually transient with mild nausea, vomiting, headache, GI discomfort, but it can also produce psychological distress, what is colloquially known as bad trips, which is usually manageable with psychotherapeutic support during the sessions. It's metabolized solely by the glucuronidation pathway in the liver with no CYP interactions, but there is concern for diminished effects of psilocybin and possible serotonin syndrome if taken concurrently with SSRIs. So what about the history of psilocybin? There's evidence that psychoactive mushrooms have been used in spiritual ceremonies for millennia, with ancient prehistoric cave paintings in Spain and Algeria showing mushrooms that are thought to be psychoactive, implicating their cultural significance. And in Oaxaca, the language of the Aztecs, the mushrooms were called, I'm not going to try to butcher that, or God's flesh. Reports from conquistador explorers as early as the 15th century talk of their use in religious ceremonies. And this is, I'm not sure how well you guys can see it, but a cave painting found in Spain where there's a cow up here, and then in the bottom right, what's believed to be a bunch of mushrooms. And the reason why they put that together is there are mushrooms in the area that look very similar to these, and they only grow on cow dung. So they believe that this is why these two were put together, is because there's some cultural significance of the mushrooms growing next to the cattle. And this is a 6,000-year-old cave painting. Shows you how far back this goes. And this is another picture showing where mushrooms, psychoactive mushrooms, are found worldwide. Each of these is a different species and where it's primarily located all across the world for the psychoactive mushrooms. Despite being found worldwide and possibilities of being used in prehistory, there's very little documentation at all of these mushrooms being used for their psychedelic properties in Western literature or science until the mid-1900s. In 1957, Gordon Wasson, an amateur ethnobotanist, and his wife Valentina Wasson observed psilocybin rituals in a Mazatec Mexican village by a shaman, Maria Sabina, and later partaked themselves. They published their experiences in the popular American weekly magazine, Life, which was titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom. Later that year, Albert Hoffman, apparently a fan of Life magazine, requested samples of the mushroom, and subsequently he isolated the compound psilocybin. And then Sandoz Labs began distributing the synthesized psilocybin for research purposes worldwide. In the early 60s, Harvard University became an uncontrolled testing ground for psilocybin. If you guys remember me talking about this not too long ago, Timothy Leary and his associates began abusing and sending out the substance to other people. This further galvanized public backlash and the eventual war on drugs, effectively stopping all research with psilocybin in 1970. However, psilocybin continued to become more popular and was being grown in households and distributed all over the world as magic mushrooms, both legally and illegally. In the 2000s, research began again thanks to researchers worldwide. That includes places like Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. In 2018, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation for psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression. What that means is that preliminary clinical trials indicate that the therapy may offer substantial treatment advantages over existing options for patients with serious or life-threatening diseases, in this case, depression. And in 2019, Johns Hopkins opened its Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, which has only further expedited the funding and research into psilocybin and other psychedelics. So how does the magic in magic mushrooms happen? Like any good magician, we still don't quite know. A lot of ongoing research on this, but what we do know is that psilocybin binds with high affinity to 5-HT2A receptors in the brain that are densely located in areas of the brain that are responsible for the mediation of mood and anxiety disorders. Unlike many other hallucinogens, however, psilocybin has very little affinity at all for dopamine receptors. Downstream molecular mechanisms of action have not yet been fully elucidated, but in addition to the effects on the neural networks and synaptogenesis as previously discussed, psilocybin and other tryptamine psychedelics can be thought of as fast-acting antidepressants, which is why I like this diagram so much. So the top, it shows 5-HT1A receptor-rich parts of the brain, which are primarily affected by SSRIs, but chronic use. So as everyone in this room is well aware, SSRIs take weeks to months for them to have their actual effects. But at the bottom, you can see 5-HT2A receptor mediated emotional release, which is modulated by psychedelics. And this is just in one or a few doses of psychedelics. And in particular, SSRIs reduce stress, impulsivity, aggression, anxiety, affecting those neural networks we previously discussed. And psilocybin or other psychedelics can do the same thing as well in terms of reducing rigid thinking. It's thought this is a default mode network being deactivated or reduced. And the functions enhanced would be the environmental sensitivity, emotional release. This is thought to be more related to the salience network or the emotional networks of the brain. And overall, these effects result in decreased depression and overall increased well-being. It's worth noting, though, that SSRIs attenuate amygdala hyperreactivity, but psilocybin in particular has been shown to increase amygdala sensitivity to positive emotions and not negative ones. And this may partly explain the increased emotional reactivity during psilocybin therapy, opposite of what is typically seen with chronic SSRI use. When used in conjunction with therapy, this allows the patient to have space for more positive emotions and to reprocess problematic and/or stuck memories. So this is my last short video. This one, I want to emphasize the psychodynamic aspects of catharsis that are also provided from these therapies. This is a powerful short video showing a patient with depression undergoing a session of psilocybin-assisted therapy.
Did you know that there's a simple combination of natural ingredients that will help you poop out pounds of old rotten waste in your colon within just a matter of days, and without the side effects commonly associated?
Can you fast forward to the 2905?
I could feel that he was suffering so much, but I could also feel that it was really important for him to be suffering. So I was kind of pleased in a weird way that he was going through it, thinking, yes, now we're getting to the stuff, you know, this is what's been causing you so much suffering, so we need to get it out. And he was really in a battle with a large, dark, evil force that he associated with his mum.
Go away. Go away. You're not coming in.
There was so much darkness and so much pain. There were moments of thinking, where's this going to go? How's it going to be by the end of the day? You know, what if this doesn't get resolved? There was a sense from the last session of his dad being kind of wonderful and his mum being kind of terrible and evil.
Well done, Dad. Well done, Dad. Well done. What sort of evolved out of today was that it really doesn't matter if there was one person doing right, the other one doing wrong. What actually matters at the end is resolution and love, because that is the big thing that came out for me today, is that the more you hate something, the more you feed it with that hate, the bigger it gets. And that's what's been going on. I've been feeding this thing, it's been consuming me. And now I've got to the realization that if I stop feeding it with hate, it evaporates, it goes away. Yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Of course it is. Are
you out?
And as soon as that realization occurred, because I had the representation of my father and Vonnie and the boys on my chest, but I didn't have a representation of Mum. So I took a picture and brought her in to that union, really, at the end. And we were kind of one again, but one hell of a battle. I wouldn't want to do it again. I've been the happiest ever in my life, and I've been the most terrified in my life in the same day, probably in the space of half an hour.
So good?
Really good. Exhausting, but...
Okay. So future of psilocybin-assisted therapy. Compass Pathways, it's a private company that has funded much of the research on psilocybin to date. They started its phase 3 studies of psilocybin-assisted therapy this year after the positive results from its phase 2 studies were released last year. Psilocybin is likely to be rescheduled in the next few years as an FDA-approved treatment with therapy, but some states and cities are getting ahead of the gun and decriminalizing the production and access to psilocybin-containing mushrooms. In particular, in the last few years, Colorado and Oregon have actually legalized psilocybin use. And I believe Oregon this year is going to start allowing psilocybin to be used in therapy sessions by non-medical professionals. And Washington, D.C. has decriminalized psilocybin use on the streets. Compass and multiple other private companies are attempting to patent their synthesis of psilocybin and the package of their assisted therapy modalities in preparation for its likely rescheduling. This is an ongoing issue of how best to control a substance that has been in use for millennia, with many future avenues limiting its use to those with access to insurance or money and preventing others less fortunate from legally obtaining it. So that brings us to our last substance, and I'm going to go a little bit faster with these slides just in the interest of time, but our last substance is MDMA. So if you're having a difficult time remembering what MDMA is, there's this poem at the top. And it's roses are red, grass is green, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. You should be able to remember it forever now. Recreationally, though, it's known as ecstasy, molly, candy, sweet tarts, smarties, rolls, many other names. But clinically speaking, MDMA should not be confused with those substances because on the streets, those substances are usually adulterated with other substances, whether they be stimulants or opiates like fentanyl. I would not put them in the same category. This is becoming a hot topic in psychotherapeutic, military, and PTSD treatment circles due to its inactogenic effect. In terms of safety and risk, clinically doses usually range from about 80 to 180 milligrams of pure MDMA, which is roughly equivalent to about 1 to 3 times the amount of MDMA in a dose found on the streets. And the effects last about 6 hours. Side effects are usually very mild and limited, with hypertension and tachycardia being some of the most predominant, and pre-existing cardiac conditions may be a contraindication for use. It should not be taken with other psychotropics due to its cytochrome interactions and its decreased efficacy if taken with SSRIs. So a brief history of MDMA, it was first synthesized in 1912, making it, in terms of synthesis, older than psilocybin or ketamine. It was then re-examined by the Germans during World War II and then by the US government after World War II. But it wasn't until the turn of the 1970s that it began to gain a psychotherapeutic potential. The 1980s saw a cultural surge in popularity as a club and rave drug. And in 1985, it was emergently made a Schedule I substance despite the DEA administrative law judge at the time presiding over the case recommending that it be designated as Schedule III instead of Schedule I. In direct response to this scheduling of MDMA to Schedule I, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, was formed in 1986. In 2010, MAPS published their first clinical trial for MDMA as a therapeutic adjunct. In 2017, MDMA gained FDA breakthrough therapy status, similar to psilocybin. In 2022, their first expanded access, known as compassionate use, patients started receiving MDMA assisted therapy. What that means is that these are patients who are not actually in research studies, but still receiving the substance legally out of compassionate use. So how does MDMA work? Neurobiologically, it upregulates levels of monoamines, primarily serotonin and norepinephrine, but it also upregulates the release of oxytocin, which they believe contributes to its effects. Similar to other psychedelic assisted therapies, it is also thought to modulate the default mode network and salience network in a way that benefits psychotherapy. But in particular, fMRI studies have shown a decrease in amygdala activity while increasing emotional reward circuit and cortical hippocampus activity. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. I have a few minutes. Yes, sir. So we'll go ahead and I was going to show the most recent PTSD related study from MAPS on this. Just real quick, so I'm going to point out what this study, in terms of results, is that 88% of participants with severe PTSD had a clinical response 2 months after they received their last dose of MDMA assisted therapy session, with 67% of those in the active arm being in remission from their PTSD. That's compared to 33% in the placebo group. And the effect size of this was 0.91 in the between group and 2.1 in the within group. And when you compare it to the effect sizes of most psychotropic medications we prescribe, it just blows them out of the water. They're usually like around 0.3, 0.4 or so. There was no adverse effects in that study. So in terms of the future of MDMA-assisted therapy, the final phase of research needed for FDA approval of MDMA has been finished. It should be published later this year, and then is expected to gain FDA approval next year. Ongoing research of multiple VA hospitals via expanded access programs ongoing. And many sites throughout the US have already established their clinics and just waiting for FDA approval to get things going. So in summary, we've discussed the term psychedelic assisted therapy and the history of these treatments and how we got to where we currently are. We explored some of the most evidence-based psychedelic assisted modalities and the treatment designs, and we discussed expectations for these treatments. My citations and questions.
Ask a question, Doctor.
They just approved these in Australia for treatment-resistant PTSD and depression. So, you know, I think what you're describing is we need more stuff, right? Our diseases and disorders are heterogeneous, and so we need a lot of different things to match the needs of the patient. And I'm standing here because I want to share with you, Noah, there's an email out by USIS to its medical students, and